She pointed to my driveway like it was a crime scene. "You have 24 hours to move that car, or we'll have it towed." Behind her, 2 board members stood smirking, city notice in hand. But what she didn't know, that car was evidence in an ongoing federal case, and I don't take orders from a garden club. My name's Nathan Cole. I'm 47 years old, a father of 2, and a deputy US Marshal. I've served warrants across 3 states, walked into cartel compounds, and helped bring down fugitives who thought they'd never see a courtroom again. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the HOA board in Sycamore Ridge. I moved here with my wife and kids in March of 2022 because we wanted peace, a yard for the dog, a street where kids could ride bikes, somewhere quiet to come home to after long days in federal courtrooms or stakeouts that lasted until dawn. I never expected the biggest abuse of power I'd face would come from a retired librarian with a clipboard and a grudge. See, in my line of work, you're trained to spot patterns, intimidation, manipulation, control tactics. So when I got that first HOA violation over a government-issued sedan in my own driveway, I recognized the play. It wasn't about the car, it was about control, and it wasn't going to stop there. This wasn't just about one vehicle. This was about neighbors scared into silence, a board rewriting rules in secret, and a quiet war playing out in cul-de-sacs across America. Where are you watching from? And have you ever had to fight for something small, like where you park your car, that suddenly meant everything? Stick with me, because what started with a Ford Interceptor ended with a federal investigation, a public reckoning, and one HOA president learning that not every lawman wears a badge you get to ignore. When we first pulled into Sycamore Ridge in March of 2022, it felt like the kind of neighborhood I'll send postcards from. The kind with red brick mailboxes, trimmed hedges, and flag-lined porches that all but glowed under the late spring sun. Kids raced bikes up cul-de-sacs, dogs lounged under crepe myrtles, and someone was always mowing a lawn or waving from a rocking chair. My wife, Angela, leaned across the console and said, "This is it." Our kids were asleep in the back seat, sunburnt from the long drive, and for the first time in a decade of transfers, federal housing, and last-minute deployments, I felt still. Sycamore Ridge was supposed to be our exhale. I'd spent 19 years in the US Marshal Service, most of that on task forces tracking fugitives, transporting high-risk offenders, and coordinating courthouse security. The job was demanding, but I never complained. I wore the badge with pride. But by the time we settled into the white 2-story on Dogwood Trail, I was ready for less adrenaline and more Saturday mornings. I wanted to grow tomatoes. I wanted to learn how to fix sprinklers. I wanted to know my neighbors. And for a while, we did. Our days fell into a rhythm. Angela joined the community garden. I'd walk our lab ranger every morning at 6 o'clock a.m. sharp. The kids made fast friends with the Jenkins boys across the street. By midsummer, we were hosting weekend BBQs, bringing over peach cobbler to the elderly couple next door, and catching fireflies on the back deck. I installed a basketball hoop above the garage and a modest American flag by the porch. It was all so normal, and we were grateful. My work car, a plain black Ford Interceptor with federal plates, sat in our driveway like any other commuter's vehicle. I kept it clean, discreet, no sirens, no spotlight, no decals, just a sturdy car I used to commute between the house and the federal courthouse downtown. Inside was my gear, locked and secured by regulation. I never once imagined it would become a problem. Angela joked that I was turning into a civilian. She wasn't wrong. I bought a grill and learned how to use it. I joined a local shooting range, strictly for recreation. I even started reading again, the kind of slow books you don't rush through. I wasn't just slowing down, I was healing. And that car in the driveway, it wasn't a threat. It was a symbol of the life I had built, the duty I had upheld, and the peace I had earned. There were signs, looking back, that the calm might not last. We met Karen Eldridge at the annual block party in June of 2022. She introduced herself with a polite smile and a clipboard, late 60s, neatly pressed linen, the kind of woman who spoke in italics. "Oh, you're the family that just moved into 312 Dogwood. We were so curious." She asked a lot of questions, mostly surface level, where we were from, what Angela did, what school the kids would attend. When I mentioned I worked for the federal government, she tilted her head. "Oh," she said, In what capacity? I smiled and answered honestly, US Marshal's service. Her expression didn't change, but something in the air did. She nodded, said, "How interesting," and moved on. At the time, we thought nothing of it. Karen was the HOA vice president. She handed out the welcome packet with the bylaws, calendar, and a magnetized list of preferred paint shades. She was polite, a little cold maybe, but not hostile. We chalked it up to regional formality. Over the next few weeks, we saw her often, walking briskly at 7 a.m. in a neon visor, snapping photos of cracked sidewalks, tapping notes into her phone when someone's recycling bin lingered past noon. Again, we brushed it off. Every neighborhood has one, right? But something shifted in late July. It started with small things, a note about non-uniform lawn edging, then a suggestion that we repaint our fence to comply with neighborhood tones. Mino, R, annoying, but manageable. We smiled through it, replied politely, even hosted Karen and her husband at our end-of-summer BBQ. She declined the beer, complimented the ribs, and lingered a bit too long when she looked at the car. "I didn't know federal employees were allowed to bring their work vehicles home," she said, light as a feather. I explained it was standard procedure, cleared and documented. She didn't respond. The next week, we received a formal letter in the mail from the HOA. It was the first notice of noncompliance. Violation. Unapproved vehicle in driveway. No prior warning, no neighbor complaint. Just a printed letter with a fine of $75 and a demand to remove the vehicle from view within 7 calendar days. The car, mind you, was spotless. Quiet. Never obstructing the sidewalk or creating noise, just parked, like any other vehicle on the street. Angela looked at me that night and said, "This is about you." I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to believe in neighborliness, in reasonable people. But I knew how power works. I knew what it looks like when someone wants to test your boundaries, not because you've done anything wrong, but because you represent something they can't control. So I responded the way any rule-following, by-the-book marshal would. I sent back documentation. I referenced local ordinances, our HOA bylaws, and the federal policy on official government vehicles. I asked for clarification. They sent another letter, then another. That's when I started noticing Karen's morning walks included longer pauses by our driveway, that a few neighbors stopped waving, that the smiles at the community pool turned colder. Something had shifted. The peace we had found was no longer mutual. And yet, we stayed quiet. I didn't want to fight, not yet. But a fuse had been lit, and they didn't know what I knew, that the badge in my glove box wasn't a deco, ration, that my entire career had prepared me for abuse of power, and that I wasn't about to let my family be intimidated out of our own home, not by a clipboard, not by a fake citation, and definitely not by someone who thought the HOA had more authority than the United States government. You could say the first official appearance happened on August 5th, 2022, though, truthfully, Karen Eldridge had been circling since day one, just never this close. That morning, I stepped out with a mug of coffee in one hand and Ranger's leash in the other. Karen was already there, not walking briskly like usual, not pretending not to notice. She was standing at the edge of our driveway, arms crossed, lips pressed into a line as tight as the HOA budget she oversaw, and she was staring straight at my car. "Morning," I said, casual, non-confrontational. She didn't answer, just tilted her head like she was examining an exhibit. I didn't need her to say anything. Her silence said it all. "You haven't moved it. I gave you a chance." That afternoon we received violation number 2, delivered not by mail but hand-placed in a plastic sleeve duct-taped to our door. Offense, continued display of unapproved vehicle. Fine, increased to $150. Additional note, you are now subject to daily penalties until the vehicle is removed. Further action will be taken if compliance is not achieved within 48 hours. It was unsigned, but typed in a font Angela immediately recognized from the HOA emails. Garamond, Karen's signature font. That same evening, a new entry popped up on the Sycamore Ridge HOA Facebook group. Friendly reminder to all residents, commercial, government, and non-passenger vehicles are prohibited from overnight driveway storage, no exceptions. This includes sedans, trucks, and SUVs issued for work purposes. Please refer to Bylaw 4.3b. No name, no tags, but it didn't need either. Everyone in the group knew who it was aimed at. Now here's the thing, Bylaw 4.3b didn't exist, at least not in the copy of the HOA regulations I'd be given upon move-in. I checked it 3 times, then 4. The The closest I could find was 4.3a, which simply said, all residents must maintain driveways free from obstruction or safety hazard. Nothing about vehicle type, nothing about government plates, and certainly nothing about sedans legally issued to federal agents. So I sent an email, calm, respectful, pointed. Dear HOA Board, I am in receipt of the recent violation notice and wanted to inquire about Bylaw 4.3b, which does not appear in the version provided to my household upon closing. Kindly clarify when this amendment was passed and if proper notice and quorum were documented. I've attached a copy of the current federal regulation authorizing official vehicle parking for law enforcement officers operating under Title 18. No reply. Instead, I got a knock on the door the next morning. 7:14 a.m. sharp. Karen, clipboard in hand. She didn't smile, she didn't introduce herself, just launched into a prepared speech that sounded like it had been practiced in front of a bathroom mirror. Mr. Cole, your vehicle does not comply with the aesthetic or legal expectations set forth in our community standards. We've received complaints, multiple. As HOA Vice President, I'm obligated to enforce those standards. Your failure to respond appropriately is now considered defiance. She used the word defiance, like I was a teenager skipping curfew. I kept my voice level. There is no bylaw 4.3b. You're fabricating language to intimidate me. Karen's nostrils flared. We reserve the right to amend policies as needed. The board has discretion. Not without a vote, I said, and not retroactively. She blinked. Some people move here and assume they're above the rules. I leaned slightly against the doorframe. Some people mistake HOA policies for federal law. She left without another word. But she didn't back down. 2 days later, we received a letter, not from the HOA, but from the City Code Enforcement Office, citing an anonymous complaint about an unregistered vehicle stored for commercial purposes in a residential zone. I called the city office directly. A clerk confirmed the report came in under the name Karen E. She didn't even try to hide it. It was now clear this wasn't about bylaws. It was personal, and it was escalating. Neighbors began keeping their distance. The Jenkins boys weren't allowed to come over anymore. Angela noticed the woman at the garden plots suddenly wouldn't speak to her, and I started seeing the same 2 board members, Brian and Loretta, hovering at the end of our street, notepads in hand, like they were waiting for me to so much as sneeze in the wrong direction. And then came the 3rd violation. This one was a masterpiece, 4 pages long, bolded text. A demand to appear before the disciplinary subcommittee for willful negligence and disregard for community compliance standards. I was to present a written statement and a plan for immediate correction. The hearing would take place in Karen's backyard. I almost laughed when I read it. Almost. Angela, God bless her, said, "Don't go." But I did. I walked in wearing my work suit, badge in my jacket, documents in a folder, calm as a breeze. They were waiting for me under a canvas awning, Karen, Brian, and Loretta. 3 lawn chairs and a folding table, a pitcher of lemon water. They looked like they were prepping for a HOA-themed episode of Judge Judy. Karen welcomed me like I was applying for a loan. Mr. Cole, we've reviewed your file. There are serious concerns about your ongoing non-compliance and its impact on neighborhood unity. Before we issue an official citation, we'd like to offer you one final opportunity to relocate your vehicle voluntarily. I laid the documents on the table, city zoning, regulations, federal transportation clearance, and a notarized letter from my department confirming lawful parking use. Karen didn't read them. She glanced at the seal on the letterhead and said, "We don't answer to federal agencies, Mr. Cole. This is a homeowners association." I paused, looked her dead in the eyes. "You've crossed a line, fabricated rules, harassed my family, weaponized city departments under false claims. This ends here. The next letter you receive will be from a federal legal liaison." Brian looked nervous. Loretta stared at her lap. Karen smiled. "If that's how you want to handle it," she said. And then she stood, dismissed me with a wave, and added one final insult. "I hope your children aren't too upset when the tow truck arrives." That's when I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't about a car. This was about a woman who saw authority and decided it threatened her illusion of control. She'd poked the wrong bear. She thought I'd be intimidated, that I'd roll over to avoid a fight. But what she didn't know, what she never even bothered to consider, was that my entire career had been about navigating power resisting threats and following the law to its letter. And she had just handed me everything I needed. Not to win, to dismantle her. By the time I walked away from that so-called hearing in Karen's backyard, I knew the situation had changed. This wasn't about HOA procedure anymore. It was personal, and it was about to get worse. 3 days later, August 13th, 2022, a flatbed tow truck idled at the end of Dogwood Trail for over 40 minutes. It didn't move, just sat there, engine humming, driver checking a clipboard every 5 minutes and glancing toward my driveway. Angela watched it from the window with a pit in her stomach. I stepped outside, not in uniform but with my badge in hand. Clipped, visible, the driver rolled down his window and looked like he regretted every decision he'd made that morning. "Just here on a call," he mumbled. "Got a report about an abandoned vehicle." I told him calmly that the vehicle in question was a federal service car, registered and authorized under federal law. I also asked if he had the authority or warrant to tow government property. He didn't. He left in reverse, never stepping out of the cab. That night, we got another violation notice, shoved halfway into our mailbox without postage. This time, the accusation was creating a hostile environment for service vendors. And beneath that, a paragraph accusing me of using government credentials to intimidate community contractors. It was surreal, delusional, almost laughable. But it worked. Neighbors were scared. By the end of August, people weren't just ignoring us. They were crossing the street to avoid walking past our house. We stopped getting invites. Angela's spot at the community garden was reassigned due to space constraints. The kids weren't invited to the Labor Day block party, and neither of the Jenkins boys even waved anymore. One night, someone left an anonymous note in our mailbox. Block letters. No signature. "If you cared about your family, you'd just move the damn car," Angela cried. Not because of the note itself, but because of what it meant. This wasn't about bylaws anymore. This was exile. And Karen was behind every inch of it. In September, the HOA passed an emergency amendment, retroactive, of course, stating that no government, law enforcement, or commercially marked vehicles may be stored or visibly parked in driveways overnight unless authorized by majority board vote. They held the vote on a Tuesday morning, during work hours, no public notice, no quorum. But the rule passed. The next morning, I found an orange tag tied to my rearview mirror with twine. Not a legal sticker, just paper, laminated. It read, "Final warning, vehicle subject to removal." I snapped photos of it. I documented every note, every violation, every Facebook post, and text message. Because I wasn't just a resident anymore, I was preparing a case. And while I had no intention of escalating it publicly yet, I was now in full collection mode. I requested meeting minutes. Karen refused. I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the city to verify whether she had filed any official complaints under her name. She had. She'd also been forwarding photos of my house, my car, and even screenshots of my wife's social media taken from the HOA Facebook group to a city enforcement officer named Don Whitmore, who just so happened to be her second cousin. How do I know? Because I found it in a public personnel directory. Same last name, same address history, and I made a note of it. Karen wasn't just bending the rules. She was building a private fiefdom under the banner of community, and no one questioned her because she controlled the board, controlled the narrative, and weaponized neighborly silence like a scalpel. That silence was its own kind of violence. In mid-September, we received a letter from the HOA attorney, a man named Roger T. Bellerose, accusing us of ongoing violations and intentional defamation of the HOA leadership. It stated that we had 14 days to resolve the matter amicably by signing a compliance agreement or face a civil claim in small claims court. The letter wasn't certified, it wasn't filed, it was, frankly, laughably weak, clearly meant to intimidate, not litigate. Still, it worked on most people. Most people see a letter like that and fold. They sign, they comply, they sell, they move. But not us. We weren't just fighting to keep a car in the driveway. We were fighting for the right to live peacefully, to not be harassed, to not be ruled by false authority. Angela said it best one night as we sat on the porch, watching Karen pass by like a vulture circling a still warm kill. They want us gone, because we didn't bow. and they almost got what they wanted. Our youngest, Maya, started asking why her friends didn't want to come over anymore. Our oldest, Caleb, got into a fight at school after someone said his dad was in trouble with the neighborhood police. Angela couldn't go to the grocery store without someone whispering behind a cart. This wasn't just Karen. It was the system she built. It was the fear she instilled. It was a neighborhood so conditioned by control that people forgot how to question it. So I started asking questions for them. I filed a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory board. I gathered witness statements, quiet ones, DMs from neighbors who said, "I support you, but I can't go public." Screenshots of Facebook posts deleted after 1 hour, pictures of Karen's own car parked illegally by the hydrant every Sunday. I even found an old resident, Mark Dawson, who'd lived 2 doors down from Karen in 2019 before he suddenly moved for work, a retired cop. I reached out. He told me everything. About how Karen rewrote the board rules while the president was on vacation, about how she used anonymous letters as a way to create paper trails, about how she systematically pushed out 6 families in less than 4 years, all of them former military, first responders, or single parents. Mark said, "She doesn't hate your car, man. She hates that she can't scare you." That's when the anger burned off, and resolve took its place. Because now I understood something deeper. Karen wasn't a one-off. She was the product of a culture where petty power goes unchecked, where clipboards become cudgels, and policies become weapons when wielded by someone just smart enough to manipulate a system most people never question, but I do question. It's my job to question. And I had built my entire career dismantling systems of abuse, quiet ones, hidden ones, ones that wrap themselves in language like compliance and standards and community preservation. That's when I knew it was time to act. Not in anger, not in protest, but methodically, lawfully, with precision, because I wasn't just going to stop Karen, I was going to make sure she never did this again. I didn't march down to City Hall, I didn't call a press conference or bang on Karen's door with paperwork in hand. That's not how you dismantle a system like hers. You don't knock it down, you unfasten the screws, quietly, precisely, and let it collapse under its own arrogance. It started with a visit to an old contact, Special Agent Lucia Moreno, with the Office of the Inspector General. We'd crossed paths before on a corruption case out of El Paso, small-town zoning scam tied to an HOA awarding no-bid contracts to a board member's cousin. I sent her an email with the subject line, "Potential abuse of HOA authority, local target, patterned behavior." She called me back within hours. "Tell me what you've got," she said. I did. Every page, every violation, every vote held in secret, every falsified letter, edited bylaw, and misuse of a city contact. Lucia didn't say much. She just asked one question. "Have you already built the timeline?" I had. From the first citation in July, to the tow truck in August, to the retaliatory garden reassignment and the fake legal letter in September, all cross-referenced with time-stamped photos, city call logs, HOA email headers, and 2 notarized affidavits from quietly sympathetic neighbors who had experienced their own Karen-related retaliation. I had also begun reaching out to the families who had left Sycamore Ridge under amicable terms. That's how I found Ellen Mackey, who lived on Maple Loop until 2020. She was a nurse, and her crime had been putting up a metal ramp for her disabled son without pre-approval. Karen led the charge against her, calling it a visual blight. Ellen sold her house at a loss and moved out within 2 months. She cried on the phone when I told her I was compiling a formal complaint. "No one ever believed me," she said. I believed her. I also believed the paper trail she sent me, 3 emails from Karen calling Ellen uncooperative and a scanned HOA board vote with a suspiciously identical signature in all 3 board member boxes. Forgery? Possibly. And that wasn't the only irregularity. Remember Bylaw 4.3b, the mysterious regulation that suddenly banned government-issued vehicles in the driveway? Lucia had her team pull the original HOA registration with the State Homeowners Association Compliance Bureau. Turns out the version Karen circulated wasn't just unofficial, it was never filed. It was a Word document saved under HOA Rules, revised clean version, on Karen's personal desktop. Sloppy, illegal, and enough for Lucia to open a preliminary ethics review. While that was underway, I turned my attention to Don Whitmore, the city enforcement officer who just happened to act on all of Karen's complaints and no one else's. After a little digging, I found his property records. A tidy little house just outside the community, co-owned by Denise Eldridge, Karen's niece. That's when it clicked. Karen had been using a shadow enforcement loop, filing complaints through family connections to make them look official, then using those reports to justify new HOA measures, which she herself had quietly inserted into meeting minutes. It wasn't just a power trip, it was systemic manipulation. The final piece came from an unlikely source. One night, a flash drive showed up in our mailbox, no return address, just a sticky note that read, "You didn't hear this from me." On the drive, audio files, dozens of them, recordings of HOA meetings, unofficial, unlogged, and damning. In one, Karen can be heard saying, "We just have to bury them in paper. Eventually, they'll move to avoid the headache." In another, the Marshals guy thinks he's smarter than the rules. Let's remind him who runs this street. And then, the smoking gun. If he doesn't move the car, we'll say it's a public safety concern. Tell Don to send a violation notice. If that doesn't work, we'll go after the wife's garden spot. They weren't just violating procedure. They were plotting coordinated harassment. Lucia's team took the files, opened a formal federal investigation into malicious code enforcement and HOA misconduct, and submitted a referral to the State Attorney General's HOA Oversight Unit. But I wasn't done. I reached out to a local attorney, Marcy Chin, who specialized in civic rights cases tied to private residential enforcement. She agreed to take my case pro bono once she saw the documents, not just for me, but as a broader challenge to the abuse of HOA powers in the state. Together, we filed a cease and desist against Karen Eldridge and the HOA board, citing unlawful harassment, retaliation, and misuse of municipal channels. We also included a motion to invalidate all violations issued since July 2022, based on falsified bylaws and failure to follow due process. But the real hammer, a scheduled appearance before the HOA's annual open board meeting, where, by charter, any resident could take the floor and address the community on record with full legal protection. It was set for October 17, 2022. I'd waited nearly 4 months. Now I was ready to speak, and I wouldn't be alone. Lucia's office confirmed they would send an oversight representative. Marcy would be there with documents ready for public distribution. Ellen Mackey agreed to submit a statement, and I had every neighbor who had once whispered thank you now seated in the front row. The car, still parked in the driveway, still spotless, still legal. Karen hadn't backed down yet, but she would, because the curtain was about to rise, and this time I controlled the spotlight. October 17, 2022. The Sycamore Ridge HOA annual meeting was held in the usual place, the small multi-purpose room in the community clubhouse just off Magnolia Circle. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, stackable chairs, nothing fancy, just another box where boxes get checked. But this time, the room was packed. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in months sat with arms crossed, eyes sharp. A few avoided my gaze, but more than a few nodded quietly as I entered. A quiet hum of curiosity ran through the crowd. Something was different, and they could feel it. Karen stood near the front, clipboard in hand, dressed in her signature pressed khakis and coral blouse, unflappable, polished, poised for war. She had no idea. To her left, Brian and Loretta, the loyal foot soldiers, whispering back and forth and watching the door like hawks. To her right was Lucia Moreno. Plain clothes, badge tucked into a black leather case clipped to her hip. Calm, focused, observing. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Behind her sat attorney Marcy Chin, dressed in a dark gray blazer, a canvas folder resting on her lap, and a stack of neatly tabbed documents resting beneath it. I took my seat near the aisle, third row, surrounded by silence. Karen opened the meeting exactly at 6:00 p.m. Not a minute early, not a minute late. She read off the agenda like it was scripture. Item 1, approval of last meeting's minutes. Item 2, financial summary. Item 3, resident compliance issues, pending and resolved. And then, Item 4, open floor for resident statements. Time limit 5 minutes per speaker. The room rustled. She looked up and scanned the chairs. Anyone requesting to speak must have signed in on the form at the front. I stood, calmly. I did. She blinked, for just a moment, one flicker of hesitation. Very well, Mr. Cole, you may address the board. I stepped forward, unbuttoned my blazer, and placed a small file folder on the lectern. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My name is Nathan Cole. resident of 3 to 12 Dogwood Trail. I've served for over 19 years with the US Marshal Service. What I'm about to share tonight concerns not just me, but this entire community. I paused, let the room settle. They were listening. Since July of this year, my family has been subjected to a sustained campaign of harassment, intimidation, and retaliatory actions by this HOA board, most notably by Vice President Karen Eldridge. A murmur swept through the back of the room. These actions have included fabricated violations, illegal attempts to amend community bylaws, and the misuse of city resources through personal connections to file false reports. Karen shifted in her seat. She opened her mouth, but I raised a single hand. I'll be submitting everything I say here tonight to the State HOA Oversight Unit, as well as a formal civil complaint. What I present is on the record. Marcy stood and began passing out documents, stapled packets, each page carefully numbered. Packet 1 includes copies of every violation I received, with side-by-side comparisons to the official HOA bylaw documents on file with the state. You'll note that Bylaw 4.3b, which was used to fine me, does not exist in any legally filed charter. People leaned forward, flipping pages, murmuring again. Packet 2 includes emails from residents who were similarly targeted over the last 5 years, some of whom were pressured into selling, others who simply gave up fighting. And then came the final packet. Packet 3 includes audio recordings, provided anonymously, of HOA leadership discussing how to drive out residents by burying them in paper and reminding them who runs this street. I've submitted these to the Office of the Inspector General, which has opened a formal inquiry. That was the breaking point. Karen stood suddenly, loudly. This is a hijacking of board procedure. This is character assassination and completely— You'll want to remain silent, Lucia said, stepping forward for the first time, her voice even. You're currently under review. The room froze. It was the kind of silence that comes right after thunder. Karen sat down, slowly, visibly shaken. There's more, I continued. The city enforcement officer who responded to Karen's complaints is her niece's husband. That's a direct conflict of interest and a violation of municipal ethics codes. I turned to the neighbors, not the board. This isn't about a car, it's about abuse. It's about someone using the language of community to consolidate power, punish dissent, and reshape this neighborhood into something they alone control. I stepped back. You deserve better. We all do. A full 10 seconds passed before anyone moved. Then came the applause, slow but steady. 1 clap, then 2, then a wave of support, fro. And the middle rows, the back row, and even a few surprised voices in the front. People stood. Not everyone, but enough. Karen tried to speak again, but Brian leaned over and whispered something. Her hand dropped from the lectern. Loretta stared straight ahead, face pale. Marcy stepped forward. We're requesting a vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership and the immediate suspension of discretionary violation authority until third-party oversight is assigned. A petition will circulate tonight. She placed the clipboard on the table. The meeting didn't end so much as unravel. Neighbors surrounded me. Some apologized. Others shared their own run-ins, warnings about lawn height, fence color, patio furniture material. One woman said her son had been fined for unauthorized chalk art on their own driveway. It was like a dam had broken. For the first time in months, I saw the old neighborhood again. Not the fearful silence, but the shared bond, the common frustration, the collective willingness to stand up. As for Karen, she walked out of the meeting without a word. She didn't collect her clipboard. She didn't make eye contact, just turned and walked through the exit as the room kept buzzing with conversation and signatures. Lucia handed me a card and a quiet nod. You did good, Marcy smiled. Not done yet, but we cracked it wide open. By the end of the week, the petition had over 80 signatures, enough to trigger an emergency board review under the HOA's own charter. The no-confidence vote passed. Karen Eldridge was suspended. City officials opened their own inquiry into Don Whitmore's conduct, and all pending violations were formally dismissed. The driveway remained mine, and the car, still parked, still legal. But now it stood for more than duty. It stood for truth, for resolve, for the idea that silence, when broken, can shake even the most entrenched bull. From her throne, in the days after the vote, the silence in Sycamore Ridge changed. It wasn't tense anymore. It was still. It was the kind of stillness that comes after a storm, The kind where tree limbs are cleared off sidewalks and the air smells like rain-soaked asphalt and new beginnings. Karen's suspension became official on October 22, 2022. Her name was removed from the HOA letterhead. Her access to the community mailing list was revoked, and the violations, every single one issued against my family, were dismissed, stricken from the record, and marked as unfounded. There was no apology, no grand confession, no camera-ready resignation speech. But there was a quiet retreat. Karen listed her home 2 weeks later. Motivated seller, the listing said, eager to relocate for personal reasons. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn just before Halloween. No pumpkins, no porch lights, no trick-or-treaters dared knock. By Thanksgiving, she was gone. The HOA board held a special election to fill her seat, and for the first time in community history, 3 residents with no prior ties to the leadership were elected in a landslide vote. One of them was Angela. She didn't want the job, not really, but she said someone had to stand in the gap, someone with patience, perspective, and a memory of what unchecked power had looked like. So she ran, she won, and she rewrote the rules. The first motion she introduced? Transparency. All future bylaw changes would require a 2-3 majority. All meetings would be recorded and made available to residents. All citations would require photographic proof, a 72-hour correction window, and an opportunity for mediation. The second motion? Compassion. Garden plots would no longer be revocable without due process. Accessibility modifications, like ramps and railings, would be protected as essential improvements. Veterans and law enforcement vehicles, would be treated with dignity, not suspicion. People started talking again. The Jenkins boys came by to shoot hoops with Caleb. Maya's chalk drawings returned to the driveway. Bright suns and rainbow houses and crooked dogs named Ranger 2. Neighbors who had once whispered now waved. Some brought over cookies. Others brought apologies. One man, a quiet retiree named Howard, knocked on my door one evening with a folded newspaper clipping in his hand. "Read your story in the local," he said. "You did good, son. We were scared. We shouldn't have been, but we were." I nodded. No hard feelings. Only forward. Lucia closed her preliminary investigation just before Christmas. She found no grounds for criminal charges, but her report triggered a legislative memo sent to the state attorney general's office recommending greater oversight for private residential associations across the state. Her final words? Karen's case is just one tree, but the forest is changing. And she was right. Because Sycamore Ridge wasn't the only neighborhood watching. Marcy and I were contacted by 3 other communities facing similar abuses, 1 in the next county, 2 in the next state. They asked for our files, our structure, our roadmap. I gave it freely, because that's how change spreads, not by force, by blueprint. We had plans to file a statewide petition for HOA reform by spring 2023, requiring every association to publicly register all bylaw changes, conflict of interest disclosures, and appeal procedures. Angela called it the homeowner's Bill of Rights. And as for the car, that black Ford Interceptor still sits in our driveway. Every morning I walk out with a cup of coffee, check the tires, dust the windshield, not because I expect another citation, not because I'm waiting for a fight. Because that car is mine. Because it belongs. Because I do. We added a small metal placard to the porch post just under the house number. Nothing flashy, just 4 simple words etched into steel. Silent no more. 312. People ask about it sometimes. We tell them the story, calmly, quietly, no drama, just facts. Because stories like this don't need embellishment, they just need daylight. And every now and then, a new neighbor will knock on the door and say, "I heard you stood up to the HOA," and I'll smile and nod and say, not just to them, to the whole idea that fear wins. Because in the end, that's what this was really about. Not a car, not a clipboard, not even a Karen. It was about fear, and what happens when you face it. We didn't burn the system down, we rewired it, rebuilt it, made it answerable. And now, we live in peace, but not the fragile peace we had before. This one is earned, this one is shared, this one stands up. And I have no doubt, if Karen or anyone like her ever tries again, they'll find themselves facing a community that remembers, a community that knows the rules, a community that no longer whispers. Endline options. They tried to take away my parking space. What they lost was control. Or, she saw a badge and thought I'd be easy to bully. She forgot what that badge really means. Or, The car still sits in my driveway, so does the truth. So that's the story. About a car, a badge, a neighborhood that forgot what it stood for, until one voice reminded it. I didn't ask for a fight. I didn't seek revenge. All I ever wanted was peace, real peace, the kind you protect, not the kind you're bullied into. If you're watching this and thinking, that sounds like my HOA, or we've got a Karen too, then let me say this. You're not alone. You're not powerless, and you're not crazy. These battles start small, a notice here, a fine there, but if you let silence settle, that power grows roots, and sometimes all it takes to stop it is for one person to say, no. So tell me, have you ever had to push back against control disguised as community? Did you stand your ground, or are you still searching for the courage to? Leave a comment below. Share your story. Let's build something louder than a clipboard and stronger than a bylaw, because neighborhoods aren't meant to be ruled. They're meant to be shared, and every street, every cul-de-sac, every front porch deserves the same thing, a voice, yours.